at the loss of their children. In fact, one of the details we discovered when we were cleaning these frescoes in the early 1990s was that originally Giotto had taken some of the plaster and molded it into these long relief lines down the faces of the women and then painted over to depict tears, physical, three-dimensional tears coming out of their eyes, because that, of course, is what he was trying to emphasize in the scene. Okay, moving on. Subject of this scene. By the way, if you're not familiar, I'm not expecting any of you to run out and get baptized later this afternoon, okay? But if you come to Italy, if you come to Europe, you'll discover that 99.9% of 14th, 15th, and even 16th century artwork is, of course, dedicated to Christian subject matter, okay? Once you recognize the subject in one work of art, then you'll recognize it over and over again. It's like learning a new visual language, if you will. Anyone? We call this the wedding at Cana. Okay, this is a story at some point in Jesus' youth, right, where he's over here, and Mom, the Virgin Mary, attend a cousin's wedding in a town called Cana. And this is technically where Jesus performs his first public miracle. Okay? Story goes that during the multi-day celebration of the wedding, worst possible scenario occurred, and that was they ran out of wine during the wedding celebration. Now, of course, you hear this, you know, try to make it a bit more real for all of you. The last time you were at a party that was not your own, and they ran out of beer at the party, what did you do? You left, right? It's the same thing at a wedding celebration. If there's no wine, who's going to stick around? So when the Virgin Mary catches wind that they've run out of wine, she turns to her son, who she's already realized is somewhat special, and kind of whispers to him, you know, do you think you can do something about this? And Christ, we're told, turns to his mother and in a very solemn voice says, "Woman, my time has not yet come." All right? In other words, Jesus knew that the time for miracles was a little bit later on in his life. His mission starts at the age of 30. We're told the Virgin Mary then turns back to Jesus and, in a voice a bit more stern this time, repeats the question, "Do you think you can do something about this?" To which Jesus responded, "Sure." Right? Moral of this particular miracle is obey your mother, right? Even Jesus broke divine protocol because mommy asked him for a special favor. So, of course, Jesus then orders vats of water to be brought. That water is poured into these large amphora that you see down below. It is miraculously transformed, not just into wine, but into really good vintage wine. And we know that because allegedly anyone want to guess this man's profession right there? Yeah, we call them the sommelier today, right? They were originally called wine tasters, right? Taste the wine and says it's incredible that you've actually kept your best wine for last as opposed to offering it up first. And hopefully you're all picking up on the humor here, right? The juxtaposition of this large, swelling container of wine and this large, swelling container of wine, right? What else would a wine taster look like than the figure that you see right there? Some have proposed, and I'm not telling you this is true, but I will throw it out there for you, that this might be a self-portrait of Giotto. Okay? Off the record, I wouldn't be surprised if it were. I kind of imagine Giotto to be one of those guys you'd have a blast hanging out with, right? And that kind of jolly wine-drinking fellow that you see here, in many ways, I think might fill that particular stereotype of the artist. Okay, let's keep going. Subject. Remember, Jesus has gone public now, right? He's worked the miracle. We know he's particular now, so he's going to start just, pumping these things out. What's happening here? The raising of Lazarus, right? Jesus' best friend Lazarus has died. Christ was away. He was in Bethany at the time. Lazarus' sisters, right, Mary and Martha, are sent, and they say, "Jesus, if you were around, Lazarus would never have died." Jesus responds, "O ye of little faith." In other words, it's never too late. He comes back, right, to Nazareth. You can see he's just returned because he and the apostles have just walked into the frame. Right? So again, more kind of theatrical construction. Jesus goes immediately to the tomb of Lazarus and orders the door of the tomb, the slab, to be moved. And of course, everyone discourages him from doing this because they say, well, no pun intended, Jesus, he's been dead for 3 days, right? And of course, Christ insists, and so they move that tomb slab away. Out walks Lazarus, who is now alive and kicking again. Right? For me, one of the most extraordinary things in this entire chapel is the two figures that you see here. This figure in pink, this figure in blue, who are both covering their faces. Why are they covering their faces? No. One of the most extraordinary things that any artist can achieve is something called interchangeability of the senses. Okay? That is, if you're working in a particular type of art, whether it be visual, whether it be auditory, musical, or what have you, to evoke another sense. In other words, how do you communicate an olfactory sense in a medium that is strictly visual? How can you make someone hear something? By looking at a painting, you follow? Now this is something that only the greats really ever achieve, and Giotto I think does so successfully, because remember, the smell of a rotting body is a smell that most people in the 14th century would know very well, right? One, because of the plagues that occurred. Two, because most deaths took place in people's homes. Even today in Italy, it's actually quite common that if someone dies, the wake will occur that very same day, okay, in the person's home, and that the funeral will normally occur the day after. Because if they keep the body more than 2 days, it of course will start decaying and the smell will be absolutely nauseating. So by showing the two figures here covering their faces, anyone looking at the scene, pretty much up until this century, would immediately feel, right, smell, technically, that particular odor associated with that of a rotting body. It's a pretty extraordinary thing, very simple motif, but one that works extraordinarily well. Okay, next scene. Subject. Okay, this is what occurs on Palm Sunday, the so-called triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Christ rides into Jerusalem as a king, and he's welcomed as a king as well. It seems that he has gone back to the same rental donkey company, right, that we saw in the flight into Egypt. And I say that facetiously, but in all probability, he uses the same cartoon for the donkey that he used in the earlier scene for this one as well. Jesus and the apostles have just rode into the scene like we've seen over and over again. And the point that I like to make in this particular scene has to do with the three figures that you see here. Okay. One figure beginning to pull off his robe at the arm. The second figure, who to me looks like a woman, with her robe stuck over her head. The third figure instead laying that robe down on the ground below the hooves of the donkey. Okay? Can anyone see what Giotto is trying here? Curious. The fact that there are three figures aligned in this particular arrangement, each in a particular stage of removing or having removed their robe. Really? What do we call movement in these two-dimensional images when it begins to create this? Or animation, right? This is the earliest attempt at animation that I know of, okay? The second earliest attempt is also Giotto in another fresco back in Florence. In other words, he shows the first figure beginning to remove the robe, the second figure in the state of actually having that robe suspended over her head, and the third lying it down on the ground. While most artists are struggling to make people look like people in their artwork, we have a painter who's flirting with animation. Now, if you're wondering why he doesn't show the same figure performing that particular motion, that's because they did not know of an invention called photography. That would appear 500 years later, where a machine could actually capture that sequence. And it would seem a bit odd to actually have the same person appearing 3 times next to him or herself. So he has 3 different people performing the same singular motion. Okay, now we get into the actual passion of Jesus Christ. And this is the first scene that actually moves us into it. Does anyone want to guess what's happening here? I'm sorry? Okay, good. This is Judas. If you're curious, villains in most Christian paintings will be dressed in yellow. Okay, it identifies them essentially as the evil figures. Story goes that Judas decides to betray Christ for 30 pieces of silver. The 30 pieces of silver are visible right here in the bag. You can actually see the weight of that bag coming down. Judas is always the scapegoat, right? He's the guy who had Christ essentially crucified. But Giotto takes a little heat off of Judas in this scene. And how does he do that? Yeah, you know those, when we grew up watching cartoons, you always saw that little scene where the little angel's on one side and the little devil's on the other whispering into your ear kind of thing? Same thing here. I mean, any one of us could have been Judas if we succumbed to the temptation of the demon who's kind of saying, do it, do it, do it. And this is the turning point. It's completely out of the narrative order of the Passion of Christ. But if this didn't happen, then the whole Passion of Christ technically would not have happened either. Okay. What is the subject here? The washing of the feet. One particular note is how similar the apostles' sandals are to modern Birkenstock sandals. I've always found that completely uncanny, but there they are, kind of scattered there on the ground. The washing of the feet followed up by the Last Supper. Okay. Now, I used to fly right over the Last Supper. If I pointed anything out, it would be the fact that you actually have people sitting there with their backs to you, which is very uncommon. Okay. And on that particular note, one of my students very shrewdly pointed out something else that's extraordinary about this scene, and that is that no one in the scene is looking at the camera. You see that? It's either they're very good actors, or someone's in the room with the camera, and they're just going about having their little dinner here. So it's not as if they're all posing for you, enacting the Last Supper. They're just going about their business. And here, of course, is Judas dipping his hand into the bowl simultaneously with Christ, identifying himself as the traitor. Okay. Subject. We call this the kiss of Judas. Okay? And in my opinion, subjectively, this is the most powerful painting in the entire history of art. Okay? Considering its time period, considering the overall effect. The story, of course, goes that once Judas decides to betray Jesus, he will ironically betray him with a gesture of affection. He says, we'll go into the garden, the guy that I kiss, that's Jesus, that's the guy who claims to be the king of the Jews. So, imagine this literally on the sort of big screen, if you will. It's nighttime. These guys have all kind of snuck up, but now, of course, their cover is blown as they come rushing into the scene. Look at all the heads here. I mean, there are a lot of people in this crowd. The spears are raised up. You can see the axe and the spearheads probably rattling together, creating a lot of noise. You have the trumpet that's being sounded. So there's that interchangeability. You can hear the scene actually taking place. The apostles all scatter. Okay, they start running for the hills, obviously, because they're fearing for their own lives. A couple of the soldiers reach out, start grabbing the apostles, dragging them back into the scene. Peter is the only one who actually tries to defend Jesus Christ. And how does he do that? Cutting off the ear of one of the servants of the people there in the crowd. So all this commotion, all this chaos is ensuing. And if I were the director, what I'd do is zoom in right now on the two people in the center of the scene. I would drop the sound. You'd actually hear that kind of vacuum sound as the two of them here are completely isolated, outside of time, outside of space, staring into each other's eyes. And here's this large, noble figure of Jesus Christ staring right down into the eyes of Judas. Right? Judas dressed still in yellow, and he's enveloping Christ in that evil as he reaches out and embraces him. Look at the forehead of Judas, the nose, and that projecting jaw. It looks like he's being transformed into his primate form or something, reduced almost to an animal as he betrays Jesus Christ. And the dramatic power of this, I think, is almost beyond words. Right? So the cinematic aspects of Giotto. How many of you have seen the movie series called The Godfather? Right? Remember The Godfather 2? Is that really famous scene when they're in Cuba on New Year's Eve and Michael and Fredo there, right? And one brother tried to have the other killed, and there's that kiss of death scene. It's one of the most celebrated in the entire history of film. Now, I'm not telling you that Francis Ford Coppola looked at Giotto for inspiration, but I do know that Coppola has a background in art history, and I think it's uncanny how similar a fresco from the 14th century can be to a movie from the 20th century. Right? It's a rather extraordinary detail. All right, just a couple more scenes here. Here's the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Right? I adore the angels and their kind of commentary, if you will, on what's actually going on, this look of grief that they wear collectively. Here is what some claim is the most important of the scenes. This is the so-called Lamentation of Christ. They've taken him off the cross, and you see all the figures mourning him here. Mary Magdalene perpetually by Christ's feet, the Virgin Mary there holding the upper part of his body. These two figures, again, with their backs to us as well. This is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He's now come out of the tomb. And I'll leave you with one last more kind of comprehensive detail, I think, of the. It's not just that every single scene is extraordinary. It's actually how Giotto was able to arrange, almost like a symphony here, all of these scenes into a much greater type, an interconnected type of arrangement as well. So if you look, for instance, here at the Lamentation, notice how the slope of the rock goes up, and then we imagine it continuing across behind the border, and then comes down on this side. And if that's impressive, how about if we start back down here and follow that slope up behind the border and continue it all the way through up there? Or how about the fact that you have a resurrection of Lazarus up there and you have a resurrection of Jesus Christ down below? You follow? So it's not as if it's just limited to the actual scenes themselves. It's also the fact that Giotto was able to kind of orchestrate all of this into a much more complex, right? Like any great work of literature and or music. It's just not the single notes. It's the way they're arranged that make it so extraordinary. So Giotto, his emphasis on naturalism, on emotion, on drama, but also the fact that I find perhaps most impressive that we can attribute certain cinematic aspects, right, to the overall fresco cycle as well, which again, considering we're talking about paintings done in the 14th century, should not technically be possible, but instead I think comes across quite clearly in these images, okay? So with that, I'll finish up, okay? If you have any questions, guys, I'll be happy to answer them and open up the floor to all of you right now, so please feel free if you do have questions to ask. Yeah? Giotto. Anyone else? Yep. Uh-huh. Yeah, the role of the assistants. Giotto, in fact, did have a large workshop. Okay, now this is one of the big issues that we discussed when we're talking about the Renaissance, and that is the evolution of the artisan into the artist. Okay, and remember, artists like Giotto, as celebrated as they are today, were paid for time and paid for their materials, like a carpenter would be, like a stonemason would be, and what have you. And his workshop was quite large. Presumably, it is his work of art, meaning that Giotto would have been responsible in large part for the cartoons of the fresco, so their composition, the execution, in all probability, of the more important figures in each of the scenes, and then the lesser important figures, the landscape, the sky, the architecture, probably left to lesser assistants as well. I can't quantify it for you. I mean, art historians have tried using what we call connoisseurship to actually look for brush strokes and say, oh, here's the master, here's the student sort of thing. I think connoisseurship is an imperfect science and has been proven wrong time and time again, but there is a pretty heavy hand in terms of actual assistants working on the scenes as well. You had a comment as well?
I was at the Ruggiero Chapel in January of 2002
Mm-hmm.
when it was going through another restoration.
Mm-hmm.
And it was my only visit to now. So we were led up on scaffolding.
Oh, you actually saw them up close? Wow.
First year, and for me this was the most incredible experience. God taught me 2 feet away from the angel in the Last Judgment.
Oh, wow.
And I never realized that he layered plaster thicker on the halo.
They actually come off.
Three-dimensional
Yeah.
as you were looking at the flat surface.
Yeah.
So when you were talking about
The tears.
line for the tear, for him to have that forethought to want to convey those elements on
Yeah.
a flat wall.
Exactly. Creating a tactile sense to a visual. I'm sorry, the question, or the comment actually, the first question was concerning the role of the assistants, okay, in the actual chapel and the fact that they did have a role. This comment instead was about going actually up onto the scaffolding when this was under restoration in the early 2000s and seeing, in fact, you don't see it that clearly when I'm showing you the images, but most of the halos of the actual figures are also created in relief. In other words, the plaster is molded so that the halos come off of the wall space, projecting off, creating that kind of 3D effect as well, and that he would actually have the foresight to model what is a two-dimensional element technically into its three-dimensional sort of sculptural form. Any other questions? Yep.
Well, I guess it was kind of expensive, but what happens to somebody who visits for the first time? Does everybody get to go up and see them up close, or what is kind of your strategy there? How do you appreciate something like that?
Okay. In the old days, meaning, the question was, if anyone does visit the Arena Chapel, can anyone get in there and get up close to see it and what have you? You can get pretty close. meaning you can stand on the floor of the chapel and look at the frescoes, okay? The scaffolding is no longer up. The restoration, thank God, was completed, the second restoration as well in the early 2000s, so you can see the chapel in its entirety. It's kind of a particular procedure now. If any of you are going or thinking about going to the Arena Chapel, first thing you need to do is to make a reservation, okay? In the old days, and I'm talking late 1990s, early 2000s, I remember spending as many as 2 hours inside of this chapel with my students. There's nobody there. The front door is open. You just walk in and you can spend as much time as you wanted to inside. Then after the restoration, they did a very good job in publicizing the chapel. It gained in importance. Padua has now become a major hub for people going to and from Venice, and so there are many more visitors. So you have to make a reservation, and that reservation time consists essentially of a half an hour, 15 minutes of which are taken up while you're sitting in a room, which is a decontamination chamber. It's a large glass box, okay? It doesn't hurt, by the way. I know it sounds kind of weird, but you sit down in this box and they have this machine that deionizes you. They have a very special type of rug there that actually takes all of the pollutants off of your shoes and things like this. You watch a very good movie about the actual chapel itself, and they have this great graphic reconstruction of what it looked like. And then you're allowed into the chapel, okay, which is sealed off, by the way, so that when the door of this little glass room opens, it allows the group of people inside, out, and then you to actually enter into the chapel. And then you're given 15 minutes inside the chapel, okay? One of the tricks of the trade, if you're curious, make 2 consecutive reservations. You then spend a half an hour inside the chapel. That's what I always do with my students as well. I was talking earlier about this with a professor of art history here. And they look unbelievable, okay? They do the frescoes themselves are in extraordinarily good shape. And on gloomy days, they put these floodlights on. And so it's almost surreal to see them. But again, the weather's usually quite good. And on sunny days, they just leave natural lighting to illuminate them as well. And so it's a small chapel. So, 30, 40 people, it already gets pretty crowded. But it is a pretty intimate experience. Okay? I'm going to go this way, guys. We'll start with you, and I'll move over. How often is work like this restored? The definitive restorations are the modern ones, okay? And a lot of what restorers are doing today is undoing disastrous restorations from previous centuries, okay? In fact, today, the standard policy is whatever intervention they use needs to be reversible, okay? Because what we find is that what technology is giving us today might be superseded by technology tomorrow, sort of thing. In one of the comments I made this morning, for instance, when you see these frescoes with blue so predominant, I can guarantee you that the blue was repainted, probably in the 19th century. Blue doesn't bind with plaster, so they have to kind of glue it onto the walls, and it usually falls off. So the most recent restoration was the 1980s into 90s, and then 1990s into the early 2000s as well. But there were interventions on this thing in the early 20th century, in the late 19th century, in the beginning of the 19th century, and at the end of the 18th century as well. The question is, don't the paintings change? And the answer is yes. How close is this to what Giotto painted 700 years ago? I'm hoping a lot. But I can guarantee you, and this is, again, I can guarantee you this, anything done 700 years ago has had some sort of repainting, some of you saw this at the Getty with me yesterday, where they put them together, kind of recompose them and what have you. In a way, it's helpful, I think, to get a sense of what it looks like in its entirety. But at the same time, it also does, in theory, compromise, right, the authenticity of the work of art. It's a really fine line that we walk. And oftentimes, the restorers, the most famous example of this, if any of you guys are familiar with the restoration of the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, where Michelangelo painted almost the entire wall in the nude, right? And 1 year after Michelangelo died, an artist was paid to actually come in and paint these strategically placed kind of G-strings over the genitalia of all these figures, right? And the restorers in the 1990s had to decide, do we take off the jock straps and G-strings that were painted later, or do we leave them, right? Because technically they were added 500 years ago, so they consider that to become part of the sort of historical evolution of the work of art. There's no ethical book to restoration. So it's not like, okay, let's go to the Constitution and see what it says on this particular issue. It's almost case by case. The restorers need to make their decisions. And yeah, they are compromised. The question is, of course, how much? And that's something the restorers need to decide. Okay. I move. 2 more questions? I have time for 2 more. You got a question? Yep. The question is, what did I say about the 144,000 in the book of Revelation? And that has to do with the supposed capacity in heaven, or of heaven, technically, or the book.
Actually, I've done biblical studies on it, and the 144,000 is the actual Jews that would stay on earth during the tribulation period that would bring others towards Christ before
Right, yeah. Which is normally, which is reinterpreted and then manipulated, as most times it is.
Yeah, I know a lot of
Exactly, different. But you're right, you're absolutely right. That number has been the object of a lot of controversy, although in the Middle Ages it was actually imposed by the church as the official number of people getting in, which made, of course, then their authority even stronger at the time. Right? Anyone else? Wait, one more? One more? And okay.
What is the role of the wolves in Lamentation?
Yeah, we were talking about this morning here to the right-hand side. I don't remember the specific. I'm almost positive that it's an Old Testament story. Do you remember? Is it Daniel in the lion's den? In the belly of the whale for 3 days, and then Daniel in the lion's den, right? Who's then drawn out, and referring to presumably the resurrection. You might be right. In fact, I knew it was an Old Testament reference. I just don't remember which one. So in all probability, referring to Daniel in the lion's den and its association with the resurrection and his salvation from the lion's den as well. Anyone else? Okay, everyone, thank you very much. Have a great semester.